All right, let's dive into something pretty cool today. We're going to unpack a case study straight from the 2024 AP Microeconomics exam. And we're going to use something super simple, the market for backpacks, to understand some really big forces that shape our whole economy. Let's get into it.
You've totally been there, right? You see the price of something and you just think, is that fair? You probably wish it were lower. But have you ever really stopped to think about what happens when someone just decides to force that price down?
To really get to the bottom of this, economists have this fundamental tool. It's the supply and demand graph. And yeah, I know it looks simple, just two lines crossing. But this little chart is the key to unlocking the entire story of pretty much any market, including our market for backpacks. So first up, let's just imagine a world with zero interference. You know, a perfectly competitive market where buyers and sellers can just do their thing. This is our starting point, our ideal world scenario. See, right there, where those two lines cross, that is the sweet spot. It's called equilibrium. In our backpack market, that happens at a price of $90. And at that exact price, 16 backpacks are sold. Every single person who wants a backpack at that price gets one, and every seller who wants to sell at that price finds a buyer. It's, well, a perfect balance. So how do we measure the value that's being created in this perfectly balanced market? Well, economists use these two awesome concepts, consumer surplus and producer surplus. Just think of them as a way to put a number on the win-win for everybody involved. Let's start with the buyers. Consumer surplus is basically that feeling you get when you score a great deal. Let's say you were willing to pay $120 for a backpack, but you only had to pay $90. That $30 difference, that's your personal consumer surplus. It's the value you got on top of what you paid. Now, if you look at the graph, the total consumer surplus for the whole market is this triangle area right above the $90 price line. It's the sum of every single buyer's great deal feeling all added up together. Okay, what about the sellers? Well, they get their own version of this, and it's called producer surplus. If it cost a company, say, $50 to make and ship a backpack, but they sold it for $90, that $40 difference is their producer surplus. It's pretty much their profit on that sale. And back on our graph, the producer surplus is this other triangle, the one below the $90 price. It represents the total profit that all the sellers in the market make just by being there. So what happens when you add all that consumer happiness and all that producer profit together? You get what's called total economic surplus. And to calculate it, all we have to do is find the area of this entire triangle. The base is the quantity sold, which is 16. The height is the full price range, from the absolute highest a buyer would pay, 150, down to the lowest a seller would take, 30. That gives us a height of $120. We plug that into our simple formula, 1/2 times 16 times 120, and we get $960. This number right here, this represents the total value, the total happiness, created by this perfect little market. This is our gold standard, our benchmark for maximum efficiency. But what happens when the government looks at that $90 price tag and says, you know what, that's too expensive for students? This is where our perfect market starts to get really interesting. So the government steps in and imposes a price ceiling of $60. What this means is that no one is legally allowed to sell a backpack for a penny more than that. The intention here is good, right? Make them more affordable. But this one simple rule is about to cause some major unintended problems. Look what happens at this new, lower price of $60. Buyers are thrilled. Of course they are. They now want 24 backpacks. But the sellers? They are not happy. At that low price, it's only profitable for them to make and sell 8 backpacks. So, you have 24 people who want to buy something, but only 8 of them are available. That huge gap? That's a shortage. The market is now totally inefficient. Remember that $960 of total value? It's drunk. And the value that just vanishes, that's called deadweight loss. It's the lose-lose part of this story. It represents all the deals that would have made both a buyer and a seller happy, but that now simply can't happen because of the price cap. Okay, so the price cap created a big mess with a shortage. But what if the government tried a different approach to help students? What if, instead of forcing prices down, they decided to help the sellers out? This new idea is called a subsidy. For every single backpack a company sells, the government hands them an extra $30. The idea is to encourage them to produce more, not less. A subsidy is like a bonus for the sellers, so you can think of it as lowering their costs. And on our graph, that shifts the entire supply curve down by $30. Now, notice where this new supply curve hits the demand curve. The quantity sold actually jumps up to 24. That's even more backpacks in an original perfect market. So what's the price for consumers? Well, if you trace that new quantity of 24 up to the original demand curve, you can see the price consumers pay is now just $60. So they get a cheap backpack and there's no shortage. This sounds like a perfect win-win, right? Well, there's always a catch. This program isn't free. Let's not forget the government is paying $30 for every single one of those 24 backpacks that gets sold. And that comes out to a total cost of $720. Now, where does that money come from? It has to come from somewhere, and that's usually taxes. So while things look great in the backpack market, the cost is being paid by the public. So we've seen two different attempts to fix this market, and each one came with its own set of consequences. And this brings us to a really, really big idea in economics. You know, whether it's a government putting in a price ceiling or a huge private company, a monopoly that sets its own super high prices, the end result is actually the same: deadweight loss. Both of these interventions warp the market away from that efficient $960 surplus we found, and they shrink the total amount of value created for society. And that leaves us with the final and maybe the most important question. We know that these interventions often create inefficiency, but we also do them to try and achieve other goals like fairness or helping out students. So the real debate isn't about achieving perfect efficiency. It's about deciding when those other goals are actually worth the price. What do you think?